Okay, we are live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, a very special guest. His name is David Gosselin, Gosseli. And if you listen to my show frequently, you know he's been on here in the past. We've spoken a couple of times. This will be, I think, our third episode. And it came to my attention about a month ago that he and two other people who've been on my show, Matt Ehret, EHRET, and Cynthia Chung, put out a new documentary, which I watched today. I really wanted to watch it. I've seen stuff, but really was fantastic. And if you see this on the stream, you'll see the documentary. And the full title is Edgar Allan Poe's Final Mystery, The Tale of Two Murders. And it's really great. It's really fascinating. A lot of information I didn't know. It was also reacquainted me with Edgar Allan Poe because 40 years, it's almost 40 years ago, I used to have an Edgar Allan Poe reader. It's a nice big thick book of all of his readings, and really enjoyed it. And he wrote on so many different subjects, and he was just way ahead of his time, the first detective stuff. And looking at it from this different kind of angle too, the way that they put it together, I really found just absolutely fascinating. So I was really happy to watch it. And I'm happy to have Dave back. So Dave Gosselin, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me, William.
For people who didn't hear our earlier show, I know that you have a Substack and you're working with the, what's the name of it? It's the Rising Tide Foundation is also where the documentary is. Maybe you can talk a little bit about your background, your association with Matt and Cynthia, and then the research that went into this film.
Yeah, sure. So Age of Muses is now my main platform. And among other things, we publish a journal of arts and letters. I do a lot of translation of like classical texts and stuff. But there's a focus now on my part of creating what I call a theater of the sublime. So what is a new theater of the sublime where we really bring back classical aesthetics and classical drama, tragedy, the things that the ancient Greeks used to use to develop their citizens, right? And cultivate them, especially when everyone, just like today, most people are busy. They have things to do. They have responsibilities. And so the whole point is that culture used to be the place where you could develop yourself and learn, right? It was not just for men of leisure, right? Who could afford to, be a lord and just be a naturalist and study like praying mantises in like Namibia for 6 months because you got the cash. So all that to say, film today, I think is crucial because we can, just like classical Greek theater, right? You have music, you have poetry, you have a story, you have all these possibilities and ways of exploring an idea. That's way more interesting than, a treatise or something. So that's been the focus. And I have a new 3-part series on the truth about Plato, which is going to basically look at a lot of the same history we might talk about today in terms of the forces of empire and, all the machinations of the oligarchy, but set in ancient Greece and Plato's war, Socrates' war against the Persian Empire, and importantly, the Babylonian priesthood, which really sort of had taken over the Persian Empire from within, right? They have the idea of the Persian marcher lord. So Persia fought the wars, but the diviners, the soothsayers, the Babylonian priesthood, the priests of Marduk, were still very influential. And Alexander the Great was the last attempt to completely destroy the Persian Empire. Basically, he was Hellenizing Asia. He was creating a new Eurasian civilization based on Greek cultural and wisdom foundations, if you will. And he was successful right until the end, until he walked into Babylon. The second time, the priest told him, hey, if you come here, something really ominous is going to happen. We advise you not to do it. That's what the gods are telling us. At first, Alexander listened. Finally, he's just like, this is just some bullshit soothsayer stuff. And he died. He was poisoned in Babylon the night that he was celebrating with a small group. So we're going to get into all of that and how that history is playing out today and what we need to know if, like Plato, Socrates, and these guys, we really want to do things that scare the oligarchy, right? Like, what ideas scare the oligarchy? There are certain ideas that scare them, and most people, including in the conspiracy world, don't really know what those ideas are. Edgar Allan Poe was a guy who did know, and that's why we made that film. I made it with Matt Ehret did most of the research. Like, it's all based on his book. So he has a 3-part trilogy, Revenge of the Mystery Cults. And so this is based on one of those books. And it tells the story not only of Edgar Allan Poe and the crimes and sort of psychological profile of the oligarchy that he was documenting in his stories and all of that, but also the second half of the book is on Jack the Ripper, the real Jack the Ripper. And I would argue that Matt is the guy who cracks the case unlike anyone before. You know, there's so many theories about this stuff. People lose their heads.
It's its own industry, almost like just the theories. It's the artist cycle or whatever. You know?
Yeah. So getting to the bottom of these stories and these perennial mysteries that have just been around for so long, that's a strategic thing, right? Because then people can start asking, well, how did you do that? Like, how did you figure it out? And that's really what Edgar Allan Poe, his detective stories were all about, elaborating the methodology that allows you to solve mysteries, paradoxes, murders that you can't solve if you think just like we're taught in school, which is either linear deductive thinking or inductive reasoning, which we're told are really the only two paths to get to truth. And one guy is like Aristotle, Euclid. You have axioms, you have assumptions, and you use that to then infer certain things based on reality. You look at, well, it's obvious that XYZ, therefore da 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 da. People do that every day. That's how most people think. And then there is the opposite side, which is like Francis Bacon, and sort of you begin with empiricism, you begin with sense perception, and then you try and come up with a system of rules and formulas to explain the phenomena. Edgar Allan Poe he has a whole essay uh, called Eureka on the history of basically the universe, and but he uses it as an exposition to develop what kind of epistemology do you need if you're going to deal with like cosmic paradoxes or paradoxes of any kind. And he uses that method in his detective tales, The Mystery of Marie Roget, to show how you would solve that unsolved crime. And Poe was at a distance from where it occurred, but he basically solves it if people follow what he says to do. And it's actually very useful for if we read what he does in that story, which we elaborate in the film. uh, Basically, how do you parse through all the media, all the newspapers, all the stories that are all giving you conflicting accounts? Yeah, the president was killed by a furry. Oh no, it was actually his boyfriend. Or oh no, yeah, that other kid was like in a BlackRock commercial, but he's got no social media footprint. Both his parents were social workers. Hey, end of story. We never find out who these people are. You'd always just have these details. So Poe's methodology, that's really what the documentary is about.
Right, he calls it the tales of the big word ratiocination. Ratiocination. So it's like
Yeah,
a sense of ratioing.
ratiocination ratio is basically comparative knowledge, like you're comparing one thing to another. So ratiocination is, whether proportions in geometry, like 2/3, cut up a square in, X amount of different the ways, and what are the different proportions that you can then use to build a musical scale, pretty much, right? Like, so the musical scale comes from geometry and how you split up the string based on proportions. So ratiocination is about comparing different anomalies, right? The same information laid out in a slightly or subtly different way that may tell you something completely different from if that same data were framed slightly differently or one crucial detail was omitted. So Poe is reading all the analysis of the experts who are saying, well, Mary Roget, she couldn't have been killed. It must have been a roving gang, right? So they have like the same theories we hear today about weird murders. And I mean, you're an expert in this in terms of occult and ritual murder. You have the same things in the newspapers about Mary Roget's death. She was like mutilated. She's found floating at the mouth of Sybil's Cave, which is this occult, has all these occult references.
Still
And this,
there, and there's a doorway to the like Eleusinian mysteries or something.
yeah, it's on the Stevens family built the Eleusinian Fields, and they have this occult Sybil's Cave, which is an analog to the original Sybil's Cave in Europe, which was the epicenter for occultists and witchcraft and stuff. And there was an oracle and all that stuff. So all these are details that if you look at all the officials, nobody really talks about that. They're like, oh yeah, she was found at that cave.
Right. It's her boyfriend who did it, Payne, and that's it. Close case. He's gone, and then he died too. Right. This is all classic kind of like Eyes Wide Shut, True Detective stuff. Like close
Yeah,
case.
and what did they say? Mary Roget, oh, it's probably a roving gang. Just some ruffians, just kids these days, they're killers, right? And yeah, well, there is some of that, but usually, smiley face killers, all these things, right? These gangs, there's usually something else there. And so Poe demonstrates why basically all the official narratives are bullshit, but how you can know they're bullshit, and yet you can still use the stories in the media to piece together and make your own hypothesis. And so he's like a scientific thinker. And you see that in all his stories about, like, whether it's the Mask of the Red Death, where basically an oligarchy has locked themselves up in their castle during the outbreak of a plague. And it's just sort of like orgiastic luxury and pleasure and every, kind of sort of, decadent thing that you could imagine. And yet they find themselves, at a masquerade with the Red Death, with the Mask of the Red Death. So they thought they were above it, but actually they put themselves in the perfect place for the plague to devour them all. In all his like stories of his a lot of his murder stories, the murderers usually end up sabotaging themselves, right? They confess. The old man, the killer in the Telltale Heart, who's killed the old man, he thinks he's made the perfect crime. He's hidden the old man under the floorboards. Then he starts to hear this thing in his head, and it just keeps getting louder and louder. And he loses it, right? And you see this a lot actually in people who do commit crimes, right? It's more common than people think for killers to say something that gets them found out, right? That gives them away. There's so many instances of that. And then there are those cases where you got to figure it out. You need a detective because the killer is craftier, right? And so this is where Poe's method comes in. And yeah, it's amazing. If people knew the real Edgar Allan Poe, it would change their idea of literature in America. Who were the important writers? Edgar Allan Poe wasn't writing alone. He was working with Washington Irving, who was an ambassador to Spain. He wrote like Tales of Sleepy Hollow. He wrote a biography of Muhammad. He wrote a biography of Christopher Columbus. Very important stuff. Very serious writer. James Fenimore Cooper, who wrote The Spy, which is like one of the quintessential spy thrillers set during the American Revolution. And I even know like people like Schubert, like across the world in Europe, everybody loved The Spy. They were obsessed with that novel. It was really big. And today, a lot of these guys are all kind of downplayed. Poe is like this caricature that you roll out during Halloween, and it's like, yeah, the stories were just the product of his own insanity. See, so it's not weird that he was found delirious in a ditch, incoherent, and died a few days later because he was a nut. He was crazy, but that's why he was a genius. And so you have all these people. That's like actually a popular sort of theory, right? That madness and creativity are closely interlinked and all that. So it plays into all these myths that we have, and Poe is like, it's there's really a lot there when you start peeling that onion.
His works are so sober, so this personality that you talk about in your documentary, this Griswold, it somehow strangely became his literary executors. I've seen this happen when literary figures die. Their executors have no clue about their stuff, like Philip K. Dick or even Crowley. Like his executor was some college student. Like, so these things do happen. So they don't emphasize stuff. Things get so taken out. Things get sold. Like I know, like for Crowley, for instance, when he died, one of these guys came and got all his correspondence between Crowley and took it away, took it right out, snatched it out of his hands, and so now it's lost to history. So like a knowing executive would be like, don't ever touch this. I don't even know the importance of it, right? So I think this thing happened to Poe where his character got changed, but his books are freaking brilliant, man. They're almost like parables in a way. I actually got a sense of watching your documentary that he was philosophically very astute and almost a philosopher in a way, because he was showing how people can go insane from their crimes or weird things, or I think he was trying to show these states of consciousness that aren't good. Like you don't want to like emulate some of the main figures in some of those stories, right?
Right, exactly. And I mean, fun fact, Edgar Allan Poe's grandfather, David Poe, was a quartermaster general in Washington's army during the American Revolution. So Poe had a very distinguished, family line. And Poe himself went to West Point. Like Poe was involved he had a history. He was a very patriotic guy, and he was basically everything that he was doing. When we look at the bigger picture, he was involved in intelligence, and that meant for a guy like Poe, one of the most important things was developing an American culture of arts and letters, an American intellectual tradition, which I'd say is the thing that the Poe understood this, that the British Empire wanted to make sure that American culture would never really develop, say, like to the level of like a classical Greece or like a Renaissance. It would never have a fully sovereign culture. American English like arts and letters were still kind of in the shadow of Britain. And that's how Britain wanted to keep it, because this was Ruskin, actually. John Ruskin was one of the masterminds, inspirations for Cecil Rhodes. And his whole idea was that you would create an English culture that would preserve the empire through ideas, right? Where like everyone would speak English, and English works would be sort of the dominant, would sort of dominate the cultural sphere, and America would be used for that as well. And
I
like
think that's a two century long agenda, 2.5 century long agenda.
yeah, and for today, people think that's like, well, yeah, English, yeah, we're American, like that's all obvious. But like French was the international diplomatic language until like not even 100 years ago, more or less. Like Franklin Roosevelt, Queen of England, like all spoke French. French was the diplomatic language because France had previously been the cultural powerhouse of Europe. In the 19th century, France economically, industrially, it had surpassed Italy, Rome, and that previous sort of imperial setup. And
Do you think that's why Poe set a lot of his stories in France, is to like play off of that cultural hegemony?
well, the thing is that so Poe's grandfather was close friends with the Marquis de Lafayette, who was the guy leading the attempt to have an American Revolution in France, which failed. And so in the documentary, we go through how Poe was, it's most likely, the evidence suggests Poe was in France for intelligence purposes on some kind of mission and whatnot. And so he was also involved in all this kind of stuff. But then you find out a lot of literature, right? If you think of a lot of writers, famous writers, they have backgrounds in intelligence. And the culture is like is the is the soft power that is used to shape opinion. And so who's shaping opinion? It's the writers, right? Whether they're writing for New York Times or da da da. There's few of these people that are not the big ones that are not connected to intelligence, right? And
Right.
a
It's
lot
like
of them
Crowley
are.
and Ian Fleming come to mind, right? He's
Sorry.
very, Ian Fleming comes to mind right away, former Intel guy, and then he's like created the most powerful spy stuff, like you mentioned earlier, spy kind of novels, maybe in the world history, maybe arguably.
Yeah, and he was involved in sort of inspiring the modern MI6, right? He was not just a writer. So a lot of these higher level brain trust people, H.G. Wells, science fiction. H.G. Wells was not just a science fiction writer. He was at the top of the brain trust, figuring out how the British Empire would adapt and survive the sort of ascension of the American system, right? And how they would ultimately have to subvert the American system from within. That was the work of H.G. Wells. That was the work of Bertrand Russell. That was the work of John Ruskin. So these are the kind of people that, because the oligarchy is not that smart, right? And if you read Poe's stories, you find out that, yeah, they're very sort of uh, they have vendettas. They want revenge. If you go to Florence, the history of Florence, they're all killing each other all the time. They're all backstabbing. So the ideas that preserve the empire don't come from these blue bloods, right? Blue bloods, as in historically, they're blue bloods because they just sat around. They didn't do any work. They
Never
collected
out in the
rent.
sun. Never.
So the brain trusts are the people like Wells, like Ruskin, like Aldous Huxley, who sort of, revitalize the empire, its methods, and all that. And so Poe, I'd say, was on the other side. He was an example of a good guy who was actually showing the methodology of the empire, exposing it through tales of horror. It's horrific because these people are they're fucked up, right? They do all sorts of crazy stuff. But his stories usually have a higher lesson. There's a higher system of natural law that usually destroys the bad actors. So it's very interesting. Poe has a very profound conception of human nature and insight into the oligarchy that should be studied.
I mean, he kind of got the idea that there was some kind of occult takeover, some kind of like, and some type of like hellfire penetration of the United States, even back in the 19th century. And so it's always been there. It's always been there in England and in the U.S., right? Even till today.
Yeah, we talk about this. Matt has said more about this that wasn't in the documentary, but there was the antinomian conspiracy. Have you heard about that?
No, can you tell me about that?
Well, the antinomian idea is that uh, you, if you were like a believing Christian, you could still sin. You could sin as much as you wanted if you believe the right things. And so it was basically it's kind of like inverting where your spiritual self and your physical self, they didn't have to conform. The spiritual world and the material world were different. It's like Gnosticism, right? So there's this rift in creation, and so you weren't saved. What you did on this earth didn't actually change. You were saved by faith technically, and people still today in different ways adhere to that. But that was like a cover for witch covens and all sorts of things. Apparently, that's what Cotton Mathers and these people. There were witch trials, which just like today, in the same way that people go crazy about certain conspiracies. I don't necessarily want to say it, but there's like, oh, it's Epstein and it's all it's all the certain people, a certain group, but then they don't talk about like MI6, Maxwell, Five Eyes. And when you hear Epstein talk, you can tell he's actually a low level guy. He's not smart. The
Yeah, it's not
interview
that
with
smart.
Bannon, this guy's an idiot. Like he's trying to talk about banking and finance, and it's like stuff that you would already master in community college. And Bannon's like, yeah, you're such a smart guy, like everybody comes to you and you work. So much higher level people. And yeah, people can, they sort of lose their heads. And so during the witch trial Salem, it looks like just random people, ladies who like get interested in like herbs and medicine. My aunt does tarot, she's not a Satanist. There's so many like
Pitchy and all that stuff.
so many
Freaky.
new age boomers are like into that stuff. So imagine you started rounding them all up, rounding your aunt and her cousin, and started burning them all. But there are real Satanists. But it's not your aunt doing tarot and trying to cast a spell on her coworker that tried to like push her down the stairs, or you know what I mean. So people get it twisted, and you had the same thing back then. So there's a legacy. Mary Rogers. I don't want to give too much away from the film, but Mary Rogers is a crucial link in that history. And so she's the subject of that murder story that Poe wrote, which created the crime fiction genre. That then people ripped Poe off. Sir Conan Doyle and all these guys, they just stole. They're not it, but they changed the methodology. It's not at all. Sherlock Holmes has a very different methodology in how he solves crimes than Poe does. And well, the idea is that no crime is actually solved the way Sherlock Holmes says it is. But obviously, if you're controlling opinion and you want to control how people think, you want to make sure they're not too savvy when it comes to methodologies and like knowing how to compare different approaches to knowledge and how you solve problems. You just want people to have opinions, to emote with certain beliefs, and you want the culture to be entertaining, but not that it makes people smarter. You don't want culture that really gives people access to their highest faculties and makes them not want to binge watch like sports and fucking Netflix for like their
Forever.
entire lives.
Right.
Like
The three detective tales were Murder in the Rue Morgue, Purloined Letter, and the mystery of Mary Roget. Right, that's it.
yeah,
People can check those out. Highly, I want to reread them if I can find the time.
they're so good. They're honestly, they're so brilliant when you read that. And when you know the background, the story that we're talking about now, and that the film exposes, it's crazy. It's real life. It's like truth is stranger than fiction. 100%.
His frame of reference. Do you know if he when he got out of West Point, did he have military time? I'm not familiar with his history. Was he a commissioned officer?
No, Poe basically he saw that he wanted to serve his country, but it wasn't going to be through the military. It was going to be through arts and letters, through culture, right? Through basically helping America to develop its own sovereign literary culture, a culture of ideas and he was going to establish a journal. So he was planning to create a magazine that could go up against all the leading magazines and print publications in the US that dealt with arts and culture. And he died. He gave the lecture. He gave a lecture tour, and he raised the money for the magazine, giving lectures that were based on his essay Eureka about the history of the universe, and his other essay on the poetic principle, where he basically describes how you make great art. Like, how do you create a poetic effect? What is the poetic effect? Why do human beings need to experience poetry and the fine arts to have a full sort of, cultivation of their faculties? He gave these lectures, he raised the money, and he died shortly after.
Was he a confirmed member of the Order of Cincinnati? Do you know?
I don't think it's confirmed. I looked it up, but I think that's partly because, like, they just don't, there's like, oh no, it's not confirmed. But if he was hereditarily a member, he was directly related to David Poe, who was a high-ranking official and was a personal friend of Marquis Lafayette. He was in the American Revolution, so you're supposed to be by default part of that society. So yeah, it seems like he was, but officially I think there's maybe some like whatever, but he was part of the networks, the patriotic networks, undoubtedly, that were involved, basically the the good guys in the intelligence world that today we're like, where are the good guys? But part of the problem is historically we don't know. In history, like, so many of the good guys are written out, right? They're given new narratives and new stories, and people just don't look further. Everything they read about these guys is through this lens from that is basically, pushed by the gatekeepers. And yeah, like all the Poe experts, they don't talk about any of this. How is that possible? How is that possible that, like, they've never pulled any of these threads, right? Same with like Plato experts. My new series is on Plato. All the big Plato experts at Cambridge, Oxford, they're all in on it. They're all pushing similar narratives that are Delphic. They pretend to like Plato and admire him, but only so that they can actually pervert and distort people's understanding of Plato. So they're like Delphic priests. And that's what we're dealing with most of these important people in history. If we look at the official story and the major expert historians, it's just is bullshit. And
I've
that's why
heard
we need more stuff.
it's part of the slant of like academia and stuff too, is that it's not infused with this kind of classical sense anymore. So a lot of these people have that kind of paganistic view, and they do it to the same in philosophy. So they're always promoting like the most nihilistic philosophers out there, like life is just a blip of nothingness, when there's a lot of other philosophers who are kind of more positive and have a different view, but it's always like, what's the French guy? I can't even remember his name now. But like all this, like we've come from a kind of this sanitized culture that doesn't get into some of the more interesting and colorful details of these characters, and they kind of cartoonize them. Like even the comic Tolkien's here, he says Baltimore Ravens take their namesake from him. So like that's the cartoon aspect of Poe. It's like, oh, you quaffed the raven, that's it, done. You made one good poem. That's not the case at all. I think you're right. I'm agreeing with you. You're right. So many of these other figures got the same.
Yeah, no, and I mean, I think that's actually on one of the highest levels. That's how you control people, because you demoralize everyone. And the most important historical figures, if you really knew how they thought and what they were about, you'd have a very different idea about yourself. You'd have a very different idea about history and how things actually happen in real time in history. So like today, people don't have a historical identity. They don't see themselves as in history. They see themselves as spectators. not actors, right? They're not modeling their lives on an intimate understanding of the inner workings of the mind, of the soul, of the spirit of these great men. They have these sanitized kind of like, it's still like patriotic and heroic, but Disneyfied, right? Like, think of all American Hollywood cinema about the American military. Sure, there's like, wow, patriotic and like inspiring, Top Gun, great movie, right? But it's not true. It's not real. That's not how these things actually work. And if you don't know how any of these things actually work, and your whole identity is conditioned by a series of myths created by opinion makers who are there to distort reality, and they praise, right? They'll praise America, but these movies, but for all the wrong reasons, and they downplay the real important things, and they overplay, you know, spectacle and just like flashy stuff that it just becomes entertainment. And that's really how like the mind is rotted out, right? Like, it's just a horror movie. You're just looking at like scary stuff. You just want to be spooked. You don't want to get into deeper psychology or like the nature of the soul, and like, why do people really do the things that they do? Because if people understand the deeper workings of the mind and the psyche, they're going to understand how to operate in the world effectively in a way that's not convenient to the powers that be.
Yeah, he's like he's kind of like one of the early psychologists without being a psychologist, right? I mean, you can kind of say he's really thinking about what his characters are doing and thinking, and their badness kind of sometimes comes around and bites them. You know, it's there's. I think you mentioned in the film, or somebody did, about self delusion leading to downfall. So it's that's like, you know, part of the Aesop fables type stuff. You know, the paper flies too high, or somebody does something wrong, stares at the river too long, right?
Yeah, and like people though, like we know this at a certain level, but to have a like they people are made to emote through the culture. I'd say with, yeah, these watered down versions of things that don't make you that don't inspire you, and they certainly don't get you to like want to take action. So like today, it's very popular among young people. Everything is fake and gay, right? That's what they say. Like, it's all fake and gay. Like, everything, it's black pilling, right? As they say. So like, why would you care? Why would you commit yourself to something higher if everything is just, quote, fake and gay, black pilled? Like, it's a waste of your time. Just do your own thing, right? Just worry about yourself. That's one of the biggest demoralization operations. And it just, a lot of it comes from like, you don't know who the good people are. You don't know who the good guys are. And the people who are popular, who have these big podcasts, or who are the alternative truth tellers, they're grifters. And so people emote with these people.
Yes.
And then they're spiritually, though, deep down, it's like QAnon. That's the best example, right? Like, all the people who are still, QAnon was an op. Like, we even know, I don't even know if I can say this, or I was,
you can say
but
whatever
like,
you
we
want.
know who's behind QAnon. We know like the actual powers that be behind that stuff. And yeah, like it's meant to suck people down these rabbit holes where you've given people some facts, but then you destroy their brains. Like, they never come out of those rabbit holes.
Yeah.
So it's just
JFK
like,
Jr. is going to show up at the grassy knoll. You ever hear that one? QAnon said that, and like 500 people went out there with cameras to go take photographs of JFK Jr. Like, he didn't show up. And the other thing is, like, the grift goes on and on. It's almost like these alternate, media figures as well. It just never ends. And almost all, if you look at some of these guys, there've been like statements I've heard. I'm not going to name names, but like, they're like, everybody in the alternate media has somebody giving them money. Like, and all these influencers, even for like the young kids, like Clavicular and stuff, people ask them, who's paying you, is anybody giving you money? They just shut up. So these are fake. They are fake.
And so, but like, everything is not fake. It's just
Right. It's
that
not, reality's not fake. Yeah.
for these people that feel that, I'm just like, I'm just, the idea is to tell them, actually, no, there's actually a lot of real good stuff out there, but you're intentionally being fed this kind of anodyne diet of bullshit that is meant to make you feel the way that you justifiably feel. But so, to get back in touch with that longer historical battle that is still playing out today, I think that's step number one. Because no, everything is not fake and gay. It's not, there's no need for black pilling. There's no need for that, but there is a need for cultivation of our higher faculties. And there's a way to do that. And number one is to study the people who historically were successful at that, and to ignore a lot of the other gurus that's, tell us, oh, actually this guy was a good guy or that guy was a good guy. And it's like, no, they're not actually. They're bad guys. So a lot of
Poe's one of the good guys. He's an edifier. He's definitely telling you stuff, showing you stuff, and sharing his great intelligence, man. God, it's brilliant. There's just absolutely no question. Like, top-notch brain. And the stuff that he knew, like how all this stuff and the Young American movement and all this other kind of, I didn't know a lot of there's a lot of stuff in this documentary.
One thing,
this expurgated and this simple analysis of some of these people like Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau. I didn't know that he, some of his other ideas. I just knew Walden Pond, So.
Actually, one thing we didn't say that I should have mentioned this, because you brought up Emerson before. Emerson was leading the Transcendentalist movement in New England, which was the precursor to Theosophy. Okay, so Madame Blavatsky and these people, Transcendentalism is basically Theosophy carried on the Transcendentalist agenda, and it just retooled things. Blavatsky mostly stole stuff from other people. So Poe's
He's a confirmed
enemy, Poe was going to war with Emerson. A lot of his stories attack the Transcendentalists because the Transcendentalists were basically Neoplatonists. And the Neoplatonists are the mystery schools. If you go back, Emperor Julian the Apostate, all these things, when he sought to reinstate the mystery cults and paganism, he was relying on his Neoplatonist teachers and teachings. That's what he wanted to institute as the official religion of Rome and kick Christianity out. The Neoplatonists in the Renaissance, they were the guys that were perverting all of the readings of Plato with their Neoplatonic they were basically, the Neoplatonists are the mystery schools. They mystify real knowledge. They turn it into occult things that require occult initiations and whatnot. And so the Transcendentalists were modeled on that, and they had, just like the New Age, the exoteric version is like this feel-good kind of like, yeah, you're going to get in touch with consciousness and like the universe and nature. But then there's an esoteric version of that for the elites in the movement, which is the real Satanism. And it always works like that for all of these things. From Blavatsky said Neoplatonism, the Neoplatonists were the inspiration for Theosophy. Transcendentalism is completely connected to that and to Theosophy. So the fact that Poe was the biggest, basically, enemy of Transcendentalism because of his wit. Poe is actually, he's so funny. When you read some of his satires, we have some of it in the documentary for where he makes fun of Margaret Fuller, who was one of the leading Transcendentalists. I think it's hilarious. I've read a lot of different Poe stuff. It's hard to be funny in print, in prose, and Poe actually manages it, which tells you that in real life, the guy was probably hilarious, which is also a sign, right? Like Socrates, all these guys, the real philosophers, they have a good sense of humor, right? They know how to laugh.
Like you said, wit, yeah. And I think he didn't have he didn't have that we have today is a good marketer and influencer to help him look his image better. Like they should have had him, more better pictures of him, make him look dashing, something like that. Like this one picture that persists of him just kind of looking befuddled or
Yeah, disheveled and like, yeah.
Anyway, we're at the 45-minute mark. Do you have time to talk a little bit about your 3-part work on what is it? No.
The Truth About Plato?
Yeah, Plato.
Yeah, I mean, I can say some stuff. It's also good. I'm still bouncing around the ideas, so it's good for me to like try and synthesize stuff.
Yeah, I got about 5-10 minutes. Do you have 5-10 minutes?
Basically, so this is it's going to be modeled on a series of articles that were unfinished, and so the third documentary in The Truth About Plato is going to finish the story that someone started writing in the 1970s. Basically explaining that Plato, Socrates, they were all involved in political operations to destroy the Persian Empire, which was the biggest threat to Greece. And the Persian Empire, for example, do people know this? Persian Empire controlled the oracle at Delphi. The Temple of Delphi, there was a network of mystery cults, the Babylonian priesthood, the priests of Marduk, who were basically they were like feudal lords. They collected rent, they taxed everybody. It was the most virulent kind of rentier sort of wealth extraction system where everybody was really dirt poor, and you had these priests and Marduk that collected all the tithes and whatever the payments and for prophecies. The oracle at Delphi, same thing. Every king, nobody would make a major decision geopolitically or otherwise without consulting with their oracle. I'll add that today, uh, it's not necessarily always known, but I do know that this is true. A lot of wealthy people, they all have mediums. They all have people that they go to get advice. And I believe it was Harry Houdini, or who was also super inspired by Poe. Houdini was involved in intelligence as well. He was showing how all these occultists, these mediums and people, how they perform their tricks, right? Because magic, the whole idea of the magician, going back to Simon Magus, is how do you fool people into thinking you have supernatural powers? Because then people want to get your knowledge. You have gnosis, you have sacred wisdom. And so in the ancient times, it was Babylon, it was Persia. There was a network of priesthoods, which I think to this day, there is an unbroken continuity. And the priesthood is not the oligarchy per se. There's a priesthood that, like in Rome, all the emperors would have to be initiated. There was the Sibyllian books, right? All the emperors had to consult the oracles, the Sibyls, to know what they should do, right, on any major decision. So there's this spiritual control in the ancient world, and Persia was the kind of, just like the United States, is pretty much the Persian marcher lord of the last 100 years for an oligarchy that is not American, really. It's not. There's something older and deeper that people don't see publicly. So a lot of the idea of the American empire is based on kind of pattern recognition at the surface level, but there's a higher priesthood. There's something higher there. And when you look at the ancient world, Plato, his students, Socrates' students, Plato and Xenophon. Xenophon wrote the Cyropaedia, which was the education basically of King Cyrus. And that was the model that Alexander the Great used. And there was a battle in Persia where Xenophon and those forces, there was a battle over the Persian throne. And one was allied with the Greeks, and the Greeks marched to Persia to try and put in power their guy, who was going to be a much more cosmopolitan, anti-oligarchical Persian ruler. That failed. The Persian oligarchy, using the temple at Delphi and getting the different Greek states to always fight each other. That's where they're always fighting each other. It's always the same story. You get infighting, And so then the alliances break down, and Persia just subverts, and they bribe people. Same thing. Venice did the same thing. They broke up the League of Cambrai so there are these moments in
Never
history where
changed.
the empire was like almost defeated. There are these very important moments that everybody should know about, whether it's in the ancient world or the modern world, where the whole fate of the empire rested on certain strategic questions or moments. And most people don't know what any of these key moments are in history or who was involved. So the truth about Plato will take the case of the ancient world to expose, that kind of story, which applies as much today. When you see how much trouble the empire is in economically, financially today, it's basically there's a moment where the Persian marcher lord, their system starts to come undone, and the inner core of the Babylonian style priesthood, who really controls spiritually, ideologically, they are exposed, and they can actually be defeated if people know how these things work. So we're getting into these kind of moments, right? And like Epstein and stuff, like people are freaking out. A lot of people realize that they've been lied to, but that can either be marshaled into like all that energy can be directed into like Jacobin terror, which was how the French Revolution was basically turned into a massacre and prevented from becoming a republic like the USA. Had it become a republic like the USA, more republics would have spread throughout Europe, and the oligarchy again back then, they could have lost. They could have lost all their power, but they managed to subvert it by relying on the rabble, mob rule, and just sort of you know using people's rage and all these things without any idea of what's going on strategically when they were at a vulnerable place. So likewise today, I wouldn't want to be the oligarchy right now. Like they have huge problems that don't really have any solution unless they totally change their modus operandi. But if we know how these guys think, they're not really prone to change or adaptation. They usually have to bring in like they need to bring in people who will come up with new ideas. So we're seeing a bit of that. But again, there's like the priesthood, the inner priesthood, and then there's the Persian marcher lord. That applies today too.
Yeah, it does. There's no question. Hasn't changed. It didn't change in the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, other places.
Nothing new under the sun.
Yeah, nothing new. Even the communist overthrow of China, a lot of that stuff. They really just butchered a lot of those people. What came after it wasn't the Republican kind of an egalitarian equality system. At least that they said it was equal. Everybody was equally under tyranny, if you ask me, in Russia. But it's a whole nother story. We're at the 55-minute mark. Where can people find your documentary and your other work?
So if people just go to ageofmuses.substack.com, they'll find our whole Theater of the Sublime. They'll find the Poe film that goes back to the Poe film is hosted on the Rising Tide Foundation YouTube page. So you can find it one way or another. I see a text here, but yeah, ageofmuses.substack.com. I'm David Gosselin, and yeah, we have a lot more films coming. And that's really our main focus right now, is highlighting these important and strategic characters and moments in history, since we are in a very pivotal moment in history.
Right. I mean, we're in another Persian era right here. Like we're literally taking on the looks like something with the new Persian, nation at this point. Like something's going on, but which is really crazy. But a lot of great comments. Truman Show were the main actors. Yeah, I think this is a really good one too. It's Look Dissonant. Thanks everybody for being here. We had about 100 listeners, so thanks everybody. And go check out your stuff. Check out this documentary. It's really great. It's like eye-opening. There's a lot of things. I didn't want to ruin it for other people. But there's a lot of stuff that's very pertinent today. Mysterious occult deaths and stuff. that I've unfortunately been too well acquainted with. And again, the guest is David Gosselin, and his Substack is Age of Muses. I'll put a link there. And the title of his new documentary is Edgar Allan Poe's Final Mystery, A Tale of Two Murders. So thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
We are